Chapter 4, Nutrition, Metabolism, and Enzymes. So by the end of this chapter, the lecture, and the reading, you should know the importance of macronutrients as well as micronutrients, understand how enzymes work, explain the consequences of a diet lacking in sufficient nutrients, and calculate the amount of nutrients in food by interpreting a nutrition facts food label. This will actually be your Chapter 4 class activity as well. You will be doing this with 2 food or beverage items of your choice. Okay, so in Chapter 4, it focuses quite a bit on malnutrition, and this guy named Mark Manry, who's the founder of the Peanut Butter Project, which we'll talk about in a second. But he realized basically that malnutrition is a huge problem. In fact, I think it's the #1 killer of children in the world. And malnutrition, you all probably know what it is, but it's a medical condition resulting from lack of essential nutrients in the diet. Often, but not always associated with starvation. That is almost always the case, especially when we hear about it, but it's not necessarily always the case. Again, malnutrition means that you're not getting the correct amount of nutrients, which sometimes is due to poverty, sometimes is due to those nutrients not being readily available in the geographic location that people are in. Why does a lack of food lead to malnutrition? Why can't we function without food? Obviously, we can only go a couple days without water, but we can go a little bit longer without food, but still eventually we need food. We can't produce our own energy and food supply like producers can who can photosynthesize. So the reason why we need food is because it has nutrients, right? And nutrients are our chemical building blocks. So our bodies need these to live, grow, and repair themselves, and they provide us with energy. So energy to be able to do work, which means that we can have a metabolism, we can go running, we can do every single little thing that is required of us by living. So again, the energy is the ability to do work, powers our activities, helps us build complex muscles, everything that we require to live. Okay, so we talked about the macronutrients before. We have 4 of them, or we talked about macromolecules before, and we have 4 of them. We have carbohydrates, proteins, lipids or fats, as well as nucleic acids. So those translate into our macronutrients for the most part as well. So these are nutrients that organisms must ingest in large amounts. Okay, so keep that in mind. This is large amounts. We do also have micronutrients, which we'll talk about in just a second. So you'll notice we have 3 of our macromolecules down here. We're missing one of them. So even though nucleic acids is a macromolecule, it is not a macronutrient because we do not need it in a large amount. So our macronutrients are our carbohydrates, our carbs, our proteins, and our lipids or our fats. So let's go through this a little bit. These macronutrients are what power our cellular work. So we measure this kind of work usually in calories. There's 2 different types of calories and they're basically the same thing, but we have a calorie, lowercase c, and 1 calorie basically measures the energy needed to raise a gram of water 1 degree Celsius. Whereas a calorie with an uppercase C is actually 1,000 calories, or it can be referred to as a kilocalorie. This is what food labels are measured in. And that basically, it translates the same way. So it's energy needed to raise a kilogram of water 1 degree Celsius instead of 1 gram of water. So these are numbers you're going to want to know. You're going to be using them on your class activity. You might see them on a quiz or exam as well. But every carbohydrate has 4 calories per gram. Keep in mind it's the uppercase calories. Proteins have 4 calories per gram, and fat has 9 calories per gram. Okay, so keep these in mind. We're going to use them a little bit later where we can actually calculate out calories for each one of these macronutrients. Okay, so how do we get these macronutrients? Obviously, we have to get it from food. So in order to get all of these macronutrients in the numbers that we need them, we've got to have a pretty varied diet. So we should be eating vegetables, oils, grains, meat, dairy products. Obviously, you can be vegetarian or vegan and still be able to get these macronutrients in the mixture that you need, but it is a little bit more difficult in that you've got to plan it out a little bit more and make sure that you're eating the correct vegetables, oils, grains that you would require to get the things that are missing from your meat or dairy. Okay, so from our macronutrients, basically what's happening is there are these large molecules and we're going to break them down, right? So they're providing our cells with building blocks and we can't use it directly from our diet. Say you eat a piece of pizza, does that piece of pizza directly translate into energy? No, you've got to break it down into smaller units first, right? And then we're going to use those subunits as building blocks or energy. And the way that we do this is through digestion, right? You guys know that we have to digest our food in order to use it. We can't just use a whole piece of pizza and be like, yeah, I'm powered up for the day. Okay, so let's go through each of the macronutrients first. First up, we've got proteins. If you remember, proteins are made up of amino acids. So when we're breaking them down through digestion, we're doing the exact opposite of the way we built them up. So we're breaking them down into amino acids, and then we can use these amino acids, right? So we've got a protein, let's say, in pizza, and we're going to break it down into these amino acids, and then we can use these to make new proteins that have lots of different kinds of functions in the body. So carbohydrates, these guys we break down into simple sugars. So you can remember we have simple and complex carbohydrates. We break these down into simple sugars that we can use, usually come in the form of something like glycogen. And we can use these to build cell surface markers or energy storage molecules. And then last, we have fats. These guys are broken down into fatty acids and glycerol. These ones we actually use to build molecules that form cell membranes. So remember our phospholipid cell membranes are phospholipid bilayers. That's what we're forming is these phospholipid bilayers, our cell membranes, are formed from fats that we get from our diet. Okay, nucleic acids. Remember, these are not macronutrients. These are actually micronutrients because we get them in small amounts and we only need them in small amounts. But these guys, so I'll write down micro here so you guys know that we're at micronutrients. These guys are broken down into individual nucleotides, which is what we use in our DNA and RNA. Okay, so essential nutrients. Essential nutrients are something that your body cannot synthesize or make on its own, which means that you have to take it in through your diet. So again, nutrients that have to be obtained through your diet, of the amino acids which we use to create proteins, we have 20 amino acids, right? 9 of those cannot be synthesized. So the only way we can get those amino acids is by taking them in through our diet. So to be able to do this, we need to have something that we refer to as complete food. So that's something that contains all the nutrients necessary to live and not be malnourished. So in your book, and what the Peanut Butter Project uses is something that they call RUTF, or Ready to Use Food Therapeutics. So that's what the Peanut Butter Project did. They saw this malnutrition being a huge problem. I think he started in Malawi, although it's not just a problem in Malawi, right? This happens all over the world, even in the United States. But they realized that it is difficult to get some of these nutrients in certain geographical locations, and peanut butter is usually pretty readily available, and it's a really great source of nutrients. If you add some full-fat milk, some sugar, vegetable oil, it becomes a complete food, and that's what they use as their RUTF to feed to malnourished kids or to keep kids from being malnourished. And not just kids, you can feed this to anyone of any age, but they were focused, I think, primarily on kids. So again, malnutrition is usually chronic undereating, especially up to the age of 2 years old is where it really is a problem, especially in Malawi. And it just means that the child's lacking nutrients. And if you're lacking those nutrients, especially when you're so young and you're developing, you don't have those chemical reactions that are happening that are necessary for growth and development. So you end up having a lot of developmental issues or delays that are all caused by this malnutrition. So again, with malnutrition, you've got to be able to take in all the nutrients you need, digest them, and turn those nutrients into the building blocks that you need to do energy or to do work through energy. Okay, so what is digestion? I'm sure you know a little bit about digestion, but Digestion is just what you think it is. It's the process of breaking down these huge food molecules, these big macronutrients, into smaller pieces so that our body can actually use them. So to do this, we have to go through a series of chemical reactions to break the bonds that hold the food molecules together. So we have a couple different kinds of chemical reactions we'll go over in just a second, but digestion starts in our mouth and continues throughout the digestive system. There's all sorts of digestive enzymes, which we'll talk about in a second, that are required to digest certain foods. And all of these chemical reactions that occur in our body are what we refer to as metabolism. Okay, so you might have heard, like, if someone, like, say you're really skinny, someone might say, oh, you have a really high metabolism, as in you're burning lots of calories throughout your day, or you might have a low metabolism. There's all sorts of different kinds of metabolism you can have. And if you've never done this before, I think it's pretty interesting. You can look up a BMR calculator online. Let's see, calculator. So BMR stands for basal metabolic rate, and that will essentially, it's not 100% accurate, but essentially give you your metabolic rate based on your age, height, and weight. So that will tell you about how many calories you're burning throughout the day just in an average day of living. So it depending on what kind of calculator you look up, will also give you how many calories you're probably burning if you have low, moderate, or excessive exercise added in there. But say you're 5'5", 25 years old, and you weigh 130 pounds, your BMR might be, let's say, like 1,600 calories, which means that if you're eating, so let's say our BMR is 1,600 calories. So if you're eating a 2,000 calorie a day diet and you're not exercising at all, you're going to gain weight, right? If you're eating 1,600 pounds, you're going to, or 1,600 calories, you're going to stay the same. If you're eating anything less than that, then you're going to lose weight. And obviously there's some different things that kind of come into play, primarily being exercise, right? And what kind of exercise you're doing, if you're doing a lot of cardio, if you're doing a lot of strength building. But if you've never done it before, I highly encourage you to look up what your BMR is. Again, it might be a little bit different than what it says because it's only based on 3 things. But that'll give you a good idea if you are looking to gain weight, lose weight, maintain your weight. That's one of the first places to start usually. Okay, so all these chemical reactions that are occurring in your body are a result, or are your metabolism. And there's 2 different kinds of reactions you can have. So we have catabolic reactions, which are the ones that break down those larger macronutrients or those large structures into smaller ones. So this is our bond breaking. And then we also have anabolic reactions. These are the ones that build new structures from those smaller units. And this is our bond building. So catabolic has to happen first. Say we have a big molecule, it's going to be broken down into a few smaller molecules, and then we can build them back together to create something new in an anabolic reaction. I'm not sure the best way to remember this. I always remember catabolic reactions because I'm allergic to cats and they break me down. So that's how I remember catabolic reactions versus anabolic reactions. But again, catabolic, bond breaking, anabolic bond building. Okay, for both of these reactions to occur, we need a helper molecule called an enzyme. Okay. And what enzymes do basically is they lower activation energy. That's how they work, which we'll talk about in just a second. So an enzyme is some sort of protein that speeds up a chemical reaction. Okay, so if we look at the catabolic reaction down here, our bonds are being broken. We have something called a substrate and then something called an active site. The substrate is like right here, so say like carbohydrates, right? That's the molecule to which an enzyme binds on and which it acts, okay? We have an active site, which is here. That's the part of the enzyme that binds to the substrate. So you can see over here, we've got our carbohydrate binding to the active site of our enzyme, which will then change the shape, usually stressing the bond, and that makes it a lot easier to break. And then once it breaks, we can break it down, this carbohydrate, break it down into simple sugars. And then our active site of our enzyme still remains usually basically untouched, and then it's released from the substrate and we can use it again. So the way that these enzymes work, again, is usually by speeding up the rate of a chemical reaction, and that's referred to as catalysis. So they do that by enzymes, and it's by lowering the activation energy. And again, activation energy is something, it's basically the energy that's required for a chemical reaction to proceed. So if we're looking down here, we have our reactant and we have our activation energy. So the amount of energy that we need to be able to form this new product. So in that catabolic reaction, the one that we're breaking the bonds, we're going from a carbohydrate to simple sugars, right? This is how much energy we need to be able to break down into those simple sugars. So what an enzyme does is it attaches itself to this little reactant, so say a complex carbohydrate like we just had, and it lowers this activation energy so it can happen a lot faster so that we can get to our product a lot sooner. And without enzymes, basically our metabolism wouldn't be able to keep up with our digestion. So we have to have these enzymes in order to be able to produce these reactions at a fast enough pace that we can go on living our lives and doing the things that we regularly do. Okay. Okay, so we've talked about the macronutrients, our three big ones. We also need micronutrients. So again, nucleic acids, but this also includes vitamins and minerals. And these are the ones that we only need in really small amounts, but they are super important, right? So table 4.1 in your book, I want to say it's page, I think it's around page 88 maybe, gives you a sample of the micronutrients in your diet, tells you what the different vitamins and minerals are, what their functions are, where you can find them in terms of food sources, and then the kinds of deficiency or excessive problems you can have, right? So calcium as an example. We need calcium. We need it for bone and teeth formation. We need it for healthy blood clotting. We can get it from dairy, green vegetables, but if we don't have enough, then we have osteoporosis or stunted growth. And then if we have too much, we run the risk of getting something like kidney stones. So there's delicate balance between the two. Again, they are very important, but we only need them in small amounts. So we also have these micronutrients that act as enzyme helpers, and they're minerals that are cofactors or vitamins as coenzymes. They're both basically the same thing. Vitamins are organic, which is why we refer to them as a coenzyme. Minerals are not organic. These are inorganic micronutrients that we require to activate an enzyme. So these are things like zinc, copper, iron, versus vitamins. We have several different kinds of vitamins. Sorry, I didn't mean to switch that page so fast. But these guys are important because they enable the enzymes to bind to their substrate. Okay, so say we have a cofactor here, which can be a vitamin or mineral. Again, vitamins we just refer to as the coenzymes. I'll just put co-E because they're organic. And then we have our reacting substance, our substrate, which could be like a complex carbohydrate, for, let's say. So these cofactors basically link onto that substrate or into this active site. If you have an incomplete active site, I should say, they link onto there and they allow the substrate to bind a little bit more easily. So without that cofactor, these enzymes would not be able to bind to their substrate. So that's what the cofactors are really important in doing and why they're necessary. But again, we only need them in small amounts. Okay. So required for enzyme activation or to enhance enzyme activity. Sometimes they do enhance enzyme activity and make it a little bit more readily available or a little bit faster, just depending. So again, lots of different kinds of micronutrients, but the main thing that you've got to remember is small amounts and enabling their enzymes to bind to substrates is what they're good for. And they're all considered cofactors. We can call them a coenzyme, which is basically the same thing. It just means it's organic. I tend to call them cofactors collectively. Okay, so the good and the bad. We know about our micronutrients, we know about our macronutrients, and now how do we balance all of that to where we're healthy and we have a balanced diet and we're getting everything that we need to do the work that we need to do in our regular everyday life, right? So cholesterol, when you hear about cholesterol, you probably think it's mostly a bad thing, right? Too much cholesterol clogs your arteries and can contribute to heart disease, but we also need cholesterol, okay? So cholesterol is actually like a fatty acid, so it's important for cell membrane structure and making vitamins and hormones. So examples of cholesterols are like vitamin D, estrogen, testosterone. So we do need cholesterol, um, and the problem is when you get an excess of cholesterol, especially the bad kind of cholesterol. So there's two different kinds of cholesterol, and if you go get your blood taken or you get lab results from getting a blood draw, you'll see two different kinds of cholesterol, and usually the one that we're really concerned with are these LDLs. Okay, so the LDLs are really bad, the HDLs are actually good. So you want this to be, well, you don't want it to be too high, but you do want this to be relatively high and this to be relatively low in order to have a healthy amount of cholesterol in your body. Okay. We also have saturated and trans fats, which are unhealthy, versus unsaturated fats, which are healthy. So you've got to kind of take into consideration how much of these fats you're taking in. Again, a little bit is kind of a good thing, but saturated and trans fats, these are the ones mostly found in animals. So dairy or meat consumption, these are the ones that are usually solid at room temperature. So when you're looking at a steak or chicken, the fat that's on there that's solid, that is a saturated and trans fat. Okay, so this lowers our HDL, our good cholesterol, and raises our LDL, our bad cholesterol, which increases our total cholesterol. So not super good. Again, a little bit is okay, a lot is bad. Unsaturated fats are mostly our plant-based things. So usually liquid at room temperature with the exception of avocados. I don't know if you guys have seen that meme, like I'm the good kind of fat. Avocados are good for you. Again, within moderation, everything within moderation, but these guys raise your good cholesterol, your HDL, and lower your LDL, which overall decreases your total cholesterol. So the unsaturated fats are the ones that you really would rather focus on versus the saturated or trans fats. Okay. And then carbohydrates. So carbohydrates are both good and bad, and everyone's body controls them a little bit differently, especially if you have diabetes or there's lots of other things that could contribute to how you process carbohydrates. But again, we have simple carbohydrates. So these are our monosaccharides and complex or polysaccharide carbohydrates. So ideally, our simple carbohydrates are the ones that we kind of want to avoid, right? These ones basically lead straight to an insulin release. So these are things like candy, milk, and if they lead straight to an insulin release, they lead to fat storage much sooner. So we don't want too many simple carbohydrates. Instead, we want to go for the complex guys. So we can get these from glycogen, which we usually find in animals, or maybe starch that we find in plants. We have to have some digestive enzymes that can break the bonds between these polysaccharides to make them into monosaccharides. So now we're breaking them down into glucose, okay? And then it's leading to insulin release. So you can see our simple monosaccharides, they start as glucose right away. So we don't really have to digest them and break them down. They go straight into an insulin release, straight into fat storage. Whereas our complex guys, we've still got to go through a process of digestion and lead straight into, or sorry, process of digestion, which breaks them into monosaccharide units, which leads to less insulin release and overall less fat storage, which is ultimately what we want. Okay. With fiber, which again mostly comes from plants, the digestive enzymes usually cannot break the bonds in fiber. So it slows the digestion of other complex carbohydrates. So again, fiber in moderation, fiber helps you go to the bathroom. You don't want too much of it and you don't want too little of it. Fiber has a lot of benefits for human health because it's not digested. It passes through your body as feces, right? Which means that it helps with digestion and regular bowel movements, helps clear the excess cholesterol out of your body, mostly our LDLs, the bad cholesterol. Also helps lower the risk of developing certain cancers, especially stomach, intestinal, colon, and rectal. Okay, so now we're going to get into your Chapter 4 class activity, which you guys will see up on La Lima. And this is reading food labels. So you're going to choose 2 different foods or beverages to read, preferably not diet, right? Because we'll go through it in just a second, but diet tends to be a 0 on everything, so not much to calculate there and usually not super accurate. Okay, So let's go through this together just as an example, and hopefully it'll help you with your class activity that you will be doing. So when we look at our nutrition label of our food, again, you'll realize that all the C's are capitalized here, which means that we're looking at everything in kilocalories for the calories. But keep in mind the serving size that's listed on the label is usually less than what you would consume. So here we're looking at a frozen pizza. I think it's like a DiGiorno pizza. And I don't know about you guys, but usually if you make a whole pizza, you're either going to share it with someone or you're eventually going to eat the whole thing, even if it's over multiple sittings. I don't know. But the serving size is half a pizza. So if you eat the whole thing, you do have to adjust the nutritional values for the number of servings you actually eat. So say you eat the whole pizza, how many total calories would you consume? So the calories here for half a pizza are 390. So the 390 times 2 equals 780. So that's our total calories if we ate the whole pizza. Okay, so keep in mind the USDA has determined a daily value for each nutrient. So this is the amount of nutrients that you need in your diet each day. And again, it's not 100% accurate, just like if you were going to calculate out your BMR. It's based on an average person. So usually we think of a 2,000 calorie a day diet. If you're a lot smaller, you have a higher metabolism. If you're a lot smaller, you probably have a lower calorie count and a smaller BMR. If you're bigger or you're trying to gain muscle, you might have a larger calorie. But let's stick with the 2,000 calorie diet for this activity and for your class activity as well. So for total fat, we want less than 65 grams, saturated fat less than 20 grams, cholesterol less than 300 milligrams. So keep in mind that's milligrams, not grams. Sodium less than 2,400 milligrams, total carbohydrates less than 300 grams, and dietary fiber less than 25 grams. And obviously this is just regular diets, right? There's people who do keto and they try to keep their carbohydrates less than like 20 grams a day, depending on what kind of keto diet you're doing. And that's to get into ketosis. So they're trying to go for really low carbs and really high fats, if you guys know what keto is all about. That's very similar to other low carb diets like Atkins. Let's see, what other kind of diets do we have? Well, there's lots of other diets, but keto just seems to be one of the fad ones right now. And it might not be a fad, but it's here. But the other thing that you hear about often if you are really into nutrition is calculating out your macros. So when they say calculating out your macros, this is what you're doing. You're calculating out your macronutrients. So your fats, your proteins, your carbs, you're calculating all that out to fit what you best should. And just like you calculate out your BMR, you can also use a macro calculator to calculate out how many macros you should be consuming based on a certain calorie diet or based on if you want to gain or lose weight and what your current weight status is. Okay, so that percent daily value that you see on your nutrition label measures the amount or how much of your required daily value of a nutrient is provided by this food. So as a rule of thumb, less than 5% of your daily value is a pretty poor source. 5 to 20% is a good source, and over 20% is an excellent source. Keep in mind, though, this is your rule of thumb. Our total fat, and this is only for half the pizza, remember, is 28% of our daily value. So if we double that, we're not necessarily doubling the percentage, but probably pretty close. That means it's an excellent source of fat. Keep in mind, we have up to 65 grams of fat that we can eat in a day as suggested by a 2,000 calorie diet. That doesn't mean that you want to eat all of them in one excellent source of food, right? You do want to spread it out throughout. So this is kind of a good rule of thumb for something like micro and micronutrients versus the macronutrients. Sometimes you don't necessarily want an excellent source. Our carbohydrates are 15%. So that's a pretty good source of carbohydrates. So if you're looking for high carb or high fat, it's a pretty good source of it, right? But 7% good source of cholesterol. We want to keep our cholesterol pretty low, under 300 milligrams a day ideally. So we don't necessarily want good sources in some of these, but keep in mind of what's a good source or a poor source or an excellent source for some of these categories. Okay, so what is the percent daily value of sodium provided by one serving of this pizza, assuming a 2,000 calorie diet? So for percent daily value, so I think our sodium was at 2,400 milligrams a day. So if you look at our sodium here that we're getting in one serving of pizza, right? So we're just going on one serving. 830 milligrams, if you divide that by 2,400, it's about a third, right? Maybe about 35%. So our percent daily value of sodium would be about 35%, which is an excellent source of sodium, but not necessarily something you want an excellent source of. Right? So again, daily value for fats and cholesterols is 65 grams or 585 calories, which is about 30% of the calories you need per day. So for saturated fats, we want it to be about 10% of total calories or about a third of your total fat intake. So you can see total fat here, and then it'll divide it up into saturated or trans fat. Okay. Usually it doesn't go into unsaturated, but it can. Trans fats we want as little as possible, and unsaturated we want to take up the rest of the 2/3 of it. So ideally, if they show you saturated versus trans fat, you can kind of calculate out in theory what your unsaturated fat should be. And again, cholesterol, we want to be under 300 milligrams. Okay, carbohydrates, our total daily value for this is about 300 grams or equal to 1,200 calories. And again, carbohydrates have a few different things under them usually. So usually we have total carbohydrates, then we have our dietary fiber, our sugars, which means simple sugars. So these are the ones that we don't want. And then we have other carbohydrates, which is usually our complex carbohydrates. Sometimes you'll see sugar alcohols and a few other weird little things under here. So if you are doing keto, right, you're always really focused on carbs, or if you're doing anything low carb, usually you go off of, I think, you have the total carbohydrates, which in this case is 44 grams, and you subtract the dietary fiber from that. So it would be a net, you call that net carb, I think, which some things are saying now actually because people are so into keto. So like our net carb for this, I believe would be 41 grams. Might not be 100% accurate on that. I'm not super great at keto. So that's the kind of thing that you're doing if you're measuring something like carbs for a diet. Okay. Daily value for vitamins and minerals varies with each micronutrient. Again, these are needed in small amounts to maintain enzyme function and human health. So you can see the list in your book for the common micronutrients in the diet and how they contribute, but you should be able to see them on nutritional labels as well. Okay. Ingredients are always listed by amount, so they always start with the highest. So if we're looking at the ingredients, the very first ingredient you see is the biggest ingredient in that source. So for this DiGiorno pizza that we've been looking at, the biggest ingredient they have is wheat flour. Okay. Second biggest, water. Then we go into cheese, and then we go into tomato paste, right? So blah, 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 blah. So once you get down here, like yellow cornmeal, that's the smallest ingredient that we have. Be careful if you're trying to avoid sugars, which most of us probably are. Sugar isn't always listed as sugar. It's very rarely listed as sugar. We do see it listed as sugar here, and it's kind of far down the list. So if you're trying to remain low sugar, this is probably a decent item for you, right? If it's not in the top 3 or 4, that's usually a good thing. But sometimes they call sugar high fructose corn syrup, molasses, honey, brown sugar. There's lots of different sources of sugar. Whenever you see the word hydrogenated, a lot of people, you'll say hydrogenated oils are really bad for you. It's because they're trans fats. And the problem is the USDA, the way that they allow this, if one serving has less than 0.5 grams of trans fat, they allow you to report it as a 0, which let's say that this pizza has 0.5 grams, right? And we eat the whole pizza. So instead of actually having 0, if we eat the whole pizza, which if it says 0, right, we just multiply that by 2 and we get 0. But in reality, we're actually 0.5 times 2. So now we're actually at 1 gram, right? So this is kind of a sneaky way that they get you on some of these nutrition labels, is those trans fats will actually add up. And they do this with other ingredient, or not ingredients, but other factors or categories as well. It's not just trans fats that they kind of trick you on. Okay, so when you go to do your food label analysis, you're going to have to type it all out. So it'll start with your food name, right? And you can do it for a one serving, or you can do it for whatever you would realistically eat. I would just leave it at one serving. So our name is half a pizza. Our calories, we have 390, right? Total fat in grams, I'm just going to put it like TF in grams, is 18 grams. Okay. So remember when I told you the calories per gram? So carbohydrates and proteins are both 4 calories per gram, and fats are 9 calories per gram. So usually when you're looking at nutritional food or food labels, right, they'll tell you the grams, but they won't tell you the calories, right? They tell us the total calories, but not the calories from each of these categories. So you guys are going to figure out the calories of each of these calories, or the calories from each of these categories. So where it says percent calories from fat, this is where you have to do a little bit of math, right? So we have our total grams of whether it's a carb, protein, or fat. So in this case, we have 18 grams of fat, right? And then we're going to multiply that by calories per gram. So remember, fats here, we have 9 calories per gram. And then we're going to divide that by the total calories per serving, which, if you guys remember, is at 390. So we have 18 times 9. The grams will cancel out. And so we'll be left with whatever the number is in calories, which in this case, I don't actually have it calculated out. Let's see here. Okay, so it's 162, and then we divide that by 390. So our percent calories from fat would be just about 42%, right? So once you divide this, remember you're going to have to multiply it by 100 to get percent calories. So when we're looking at this pizza, we know that 42% of our calories are coming from fat, okay? So you're going to do basically the same thing for carbs and protein as well. And again, you're just going to take the total in grams of whatever it is, carb, protein, so carb, protein, or fat, and then you're going to multiply that by the calories per gram. So again, if it's a carb or protein, it'll be 4 calories per gram. If it's a fat, it'll be 9 calories per gram. So if we're doing this for carbs, let's say, then it'll be 4 calories per gram, and then we're going to divide by the total calories, okay? So that will give you, and then you're going to multiply that by 100. That will give you your percent of the calories for from that unit. So this in particular, if we're doing carbs, would be percent calories of carbs. So hopefully that makes sense. You guys are going to do that for each of your 2 food items for each of those macronutrient categories. You're not going to have to do it for vitamins or any of the micronutrients because they usually don't. Usually they just give you your percent daily value in that. Sometimes they don't even give you the amount in grams. And then at the end, you guys have some thought questions to answer. And at the very end, you're kind of comparing 2 different nutrition facts and kind of seeing how they manipulated their nutrition fact labels to make you believe that it's actually a little bit healthier for a certain cereal.